Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your hosts, Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Since this is our first episode, we'd like to introduce ourselves and the show a bit before diving into our interview today with Archbishop Alexander Sample of Portland, Oregon. You might be thinking, who should listen to a podcast about sacred music? Whether you're a priest, liturgical musician, choir member, or just someone who simply wants to learn more about the treasury of sacred music in the Catholic Church, her teachings on sacred music, or grow in your faith through a deeper understanding of the sacred liturgy, this podcast is for you.
Perhaps you're wondering about what's going on with the music in your parish. Maybe you have questions about the basics of sacred music. Is it all just opinion, or does the Church teach something concrete about sacred music? Or it could be that you're wondering what you can do to support and develop the music program in your parish. We've prepared interesting conversations on all sorts of questions, both general and technical. We'll talk about church documents on sacred music, the music of certain composers and eras, Gregorian chant, the role of music in Catholic education, and techniques for directing a better choir rehearsal.
We'll interview bishops, priests, music directors, composers, teachers, philosophers, and theologians. We'll talk to people who found a home in the Catholic Church because they heard the call of Christ in the Church's sacred music. We'll look at really renowned music programs and discover how they work and can serve as models for others. We'll introduce you to Catholics who love their faith and, through sacred music, offer all their efforts for God's glory and the sanctification of all who hear them. We aim for our podcast to be thoughtful, encouraging, and informative. We hope, too, that it will inspire and motivate you to work for the renewal of authentic beauty in sacred music, whatever your musical level or position in the Church.
To introduce ourselves a bit today, I'm Peter Carter, and I'm the Director of Music at St. John the Baptist Parish in Allentown, New Jersey, not Allentown, Pennsylvania. I am a graduate of Westminster Choir College in Princeton, and in addition to my parish responsibilities, I also work as a professional singer, organist, conductor, and clinician on sacred music and Gregorian chant.
And I'm Dr. Jennifer Donaldson. I'm the Director of Sacred Music and an Associate Professor at St. Joseph's Seminary, Dunwoody, in New York. I direct the Schola Cantorum there, teach the seminarians, and also teach the lay master's students at the seminary who are enrolled in our St. Cecilia Academy for Pastoral Musicians. This is a program for musicians to obtain certification as a musician in the Archdiocese of New York. And we also offer classes online and during the summer for musicians from outside the area who are interested in graduate-level study in sacred music. There's a lot more information about ourselves and our work in sacred music on our website, sacredmusicpodcast.com. But let's get started with our interview today with Archbishop Alexander Sample.
He was appointed Bishop of Marquette on December 13, 2005 by Pope Benedict XVI, and then the Archbishop of Portland in the beginning of 2013. The Archbishop has degrees in engineering and canon law. He serves on the USCCB's Committee on Pro-Life Activities, the Subcommittee on the Catechism, and is on the Board of Trustees for the Catholic Near East Welfare Association and the Oregon Catholic Press. His love for the sacred liturgy and sacred music were nurtured by the great Msgr Richard Schuler of St. Agnes Church in St. Paul, Minnesota. The Archbishop has become known for his eloquence and pastoral ability in teaching about sacred music and the liturgy. We're delighted to have him here with us on our program. Thank you so much for joining us today, Archbishop.
Well, I'm very happy to be with you and all those who listen to your podcast.
You've spoken a lot about the sacred liturgy and sacred music, both in your office as Archbishop of Portland, as well as previously as the Bishop of Marquette. What is it in your own background that made clear to you the importance of these things in the Christian life? And related to that, why did you devote a pastoral letter to sacred music? Why was it a topic you found so important in your Episcopal ministry, especially in a time when thought and catechesis could be devoted to so many other topics?
Yeah, well, and that's a very important question. I guess I go back to, what the Council, the Second Vatican Council reminded us. It wasn't a new teaching, but reminded us that, the sacred liturgy, especially the offering of the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, is the source and summit of the Church's life. This is everything to a Catholic. The Council reminds us that everything else that the Church does, all of her other apostolic works, all of her ministries, all of her, care for the poor, etc. All that flows from the sacred liturgy, but also leads us back to the sacred liturgy. All the activities of the Church lead us back to this celebration of the liturgy. So, as the source and summit, and as St. John Paul II said in Ecclesia de Eucharistia, his last papal encyclical, the Church draws her life from the Eucharist. And so, yes, there are a lot of important issues in the Church, and we shouldn't address the sacred liturgy exclusively. But I've often taken the approach or the mindset, if you will, that if we don't get the sacred liturgy right, then nothing else is really going to be on track and is really going to be correct. So we need to pay attention to the sacred liturgy. It's really the most important thing that we do. I mean, whatever I might do here in my office as Archbishop in the course of a day, whatever meetings I might have, whatever decisions I might need to make, nothing is more important than my daily celebration of the Holy Eucharist. And I think for me, we're all the product of our upbringing and our life experience. We all, I guess, a way to put it colloquially, we all carry our own baggage. And, my experience growing up in the Church in the 1970s, pretty much, a post-conciliar period, and, all of the uncertainty that was swirling around in the ecclesial air, if you will, at that time, and also with regard to the sacred liturgy and all of the experimentation that was going on, and I'll just put it bluntly, some of the nonsense that was going on. It was very disturbing to me, even as a young person. So as a bishop, having grown up in this period of time, I think that we need to get the sacred liturgy right. And in terms of what has been termed the ars celebrandi, the art of celebrating the sacred liturgy, there's a lot of elements that go into that, the environment, the decoration of the church, the sacred vestments, the appointments at the altar, the comportment of the ministers, etc., is all very important. But I think in terms of the ars celebrandi, the art of celebration of the Mass, nothing is more important than the sacred music that accompanies our divine worship and enhances our divine worship. So I was in the process of doing a pastoral letter really in general on the sacred liturgy in Marquette, and the section on sacred music, quite honestly, being to me the most important to get right, was the first one I worked on, with a lot of help, I must say. And then I was transferred to the Archdiocese of Portland, and so I decided before I left to issue the pastoral letter on sacred music as a standalone separate letter before I left, to try to help the sacred musician that I had just hired before my departure, to give him something to work from. But I think, a lot of other things could be addressed, and I do address all sorts of other things too. But I do have a particular passion for the sacred liturgy. As the chief high priest of the diocese, as the one who is called to moderate and protect and promote the sacred liturgy, I feel it's my responsibility, especially in a time when there's so much misunderstanding and quite honestly, aberration and even abuse in this area. I felt as a shepherd of the church, I should try to exercise my office to teach.
That's really so inspiring to hear from you, because a lot of us live that experience of, especially if we work for the Church as sacred musicians, having the sacred liturgy at the center of our lives, and to be able to talk with you about that is really inspiring. And And you mentioned just now a little bit of misunderstanding. And in that regard, I'd like to ask you, it seems like Catholics who attend Mass, or maybe even those who don't attend Mass, expect a lot of different things from sacred music. If you ask them what is the purpose of sacred music, some might say that it's engagement, and it's emotional response, liveliness, participation, praise, worship. You might hear someone say solemnity or transcendence. Since there doesn't seem to be one commonly held answer if you ask the laity about this question of why we sing at Mass, could you provide some clarity by explaining what the Church says about the purpose of sacred music in the liturgy and the role that it fulfills, especially in the Mass?
Yeah, well, I think that it starts really, it really starts with an understanding of what the purpose of divine worship is. Because if we don't get that piece right, then that will lead us into some inappropriate appropriations of music, shall we say, into the sacred liturgy. So what is the purpose of our sacred liturgy? What is the purpose of the Mass? And the Church clearly teaches that the Mass has a twofold purpose. The first is to give glory to God, is to give divine worship to God. And so the music must do that, is give worship, and the sanctification of the faithful, of the people. So if we have to start there, it seems, to keep clearly in focus, what is the Mass all about? What is the purpose of the Mass? What is the Mass in its essence? And I think if you ask the average Catholic, quite honestly, and especially of my generation or younger, what is the Mass? I think most would be hard-pressed to articulate a clear understanding of what is happening in the sacred liturgy. That in the sacred liturgy, we sacramentally and in an unbloody manner make present that once-for-all sacrifice that Christ once offered on the altar of the cross. And that's the heart of the sacred liturgy. Yes, we hear the Word of God, of course, and that the liturgy of the Word is a very integral and important part of the liturgy. But the climax, if you will, the high point of the sacred liturgy is the offering of the Holy Sacrifice, the representation of the Paschal Mystery, from which then we receive the body and blood of the Lord, if we're properly disposed, and to sort of culminate our participation in the Paschal Mystery. So that understanding of the liturgy has to inform then everything we do in the liturgy. So in other words, instead of imposing other objectives or other purposes of the liturgy onto the liturgy, we should be trying to make what the inner nature of the liturgy itself is shine forth. So everything we do in the liturgy, how we celebrate it, the things we use in the liturgy, and especially the sacred music, needs to express and bring out that inner reality, the essence, if you will, of what the Mass actually is. So that lex orandi, lex credendi, the law of praying is the law of believing, that what we believe about the liturgy, what we believe is happening there, has to be expressed in how we celebrate and how we appropriate music. So yeah, people look for all kinds of things in the music, and believe me, I run into it all over. I'm in the confirmation season right now. As my predecessor calls, I'm on the chrism trail, and I'm running into all kinds of experiences in parishes, and I think some people do. They're looking for an emotional experience. They're looking for, a lot of times I think in some parishes they think it's maybe a sin to have anything that's meditative or reflective. It all has to be upbeat and joyful and pounding beat all the time, and I think a lot of people, unfortunately, seek to be entertained, or they seek to have something in them fed emotionally or whatever, rather than understanding that the primary purpose we're here is not about me. It's about giving worship to God in an appropriate way, in a sacred way, and then to be sanctified by my experience here at the sacred liturgy.
So, Archbishop, since that purpose of the liturgy is so clear, what you just said, the worship of God and the sanctification of the faithful, how does music express that? What qualities does the Church say music should possess in order to reflect the purpose of the liturgy.
Right, and I think, and I want to point out that these I call them the three essentials of what constitutes music that is appropriate for the sacred liturgy. These are not just my opinions. I've drawn these from the consistent teaching of the Church. The first, and it's, some of these things are a little bit difficult to put a finger on, but the first is the sanctity of the music itself. That it has to express something that has a sacred character to it, and the way the Church defined it, well, the way the Vatican II described it is this way: that sacred music is to be considered the more holy, and that's the word we're looking for, the holiness of the music, the more holy in proportion as it is more closely connected with the liturgical action, whether it adds delight to prayer, fosters unity of minds, or confers greater solemnity upon the sacred rites. So the first quality is this sacredness of the music, the sanctity of it, the holiness of it, the appropriateness for the liturgical action that fosters and engenders in the participants in the liturgy this sense of and the Church uses the word solemnity. That seems to be an evil word in the minds of many today, that things be solemn. But the liturgy calls for a solemnity. We are representing the Paschal mystery. The second quality is beauty, that there must be an intrinsic beauty to the music. And I would say that there has to be an artistic goodness to the music. I mean, come on, we've all heard music, whether it's secular music or whether it's sacred music, that has an artistic quality to it, that is good music. And I'm not a musician. Many of your listeners are in terms of making that judgment. But, I can recognize a piece of music that is beautiful, that has an intrinsic beauty to it. I mean, it's just artistically good versus something that's, a lesser quality and maybe even a little sing-songy. So that beauty is the second. And finally, the third is, and this is a difficult one too, is the universality of the music as being sacred. And what I mean by this is that the even if it comes from a particular culture, it would be immediately recognized by anyone as being a sacred sound, if you will. It has a sacred sound to it that's universal, that would be recognized by just about anyone. I think, I don't care who you are. If you attend or participate in a Holy Mass and there's a sacred polyphony being sung, let's say Byrd or Palestrina or somebody, I don't care who you are, you're going to recognize that that's sacred music. Or if you hear Gregorian chant for the first time, even if you've never been exposed to it, you're going to recognize, there's something very sacred about that. And I use an example oftentimes here in the Archdiocese of Portland. We have a large Vietnamese community here, and they have a way of singing at the Mass that is very part of their culture, and it has a very Oriental sound to it, quite honestly. But it has a sacred sound to it as well. That it's not secular. It's not the way they would sing on the radio. But it's not anything I would be familiar with. But it's Oriental sounding, but it also is sacred sounding, and I recognize that immediately, that this is a sacred sound. So those three qualities, I think, are what the Church is looking for in her music.
So we've talked about the purpose of sacred music, the things that it should have in it. But now we come to a question about what should we actually be singing. And in your pastoral letter that you wrote as the Bishop of Marquette, you talk a lot about the musical structure of the Mass in the answer to the question, what should we sing at Mass? And you outline three main categories of music: the ordinary, the propers, and the orations and dialogues. Some people might not be familiar with what you're talking about in this regard. So could you give us examples of what you mean by each of these labels and how they might be sung?
Right, and I think that, and actually I learned this at a workshop being put on by the Catholic Music Association of America, and it was kind of one of those light bulb moments for me when I realized everyone has a part to play, if you will, in the sacred liturgy. Everyone has their proper role in the sacred liturgy. That the liturgy is hierarchically organized, There's a role for the celebrant, of course. There's a role for the schola or the choir, and there's a role for the congregation gathered in worship. And we all take our part, if you will, in that. So, when I speak of course, the ordinary, of the Mass, these are the things that remain the same from Mass to Mass. So, we have the Kyrie, we have the Gloria, we have the Sanctus, the Agnus Dei, the Credo, the Pater Noster, these things that are in every Mass, if you will, or, not always the Creed and the Gloria, but these are the things that remain constant from Mass to Mass. And these are parts that, for example, are particularly well suited for the congregation to sing together in a common voice, whether that's in English or in Latin, in chant, or in other styles of sacred music. So those ordinary parts of the Mass that remain unchanged from Mass to Mass is a perfect opportunity for the gathered congregation to sing. The propers of the Mass are the parts that change from Mass to Mass. So things like the introit, the entrance antiphon, or the offertory antiphon, or the communion antiphon, the psalm, between the readings, those sorts of the Alleluia verse before the gospel, those things that change from Mass to Mass according to the celebration itself. And, there's not the necessity that the congregation necessarily sing all of those things. But those could be, they could sing them, but they also could be appropriate parts for the schola to sing, perhaps in a Gregorian setting or a chant setting, things that may not be easily accessible to the faithful, but maybe over time they can learn them too. So those are the parts that I think are particularly suited perhaps for schola singing and for active listening, prayerful active listening on the part of the congregation. They don't have to, in other words, the congregation doesn't have to sing everything. And then finally, the orations and the dialogues. These are parts where particularly the celebrant takes the lead role in singing and chanting. So the orations, the opening prayer, the prayer over the gifts, the post-communion prayer, the preface dialogue, other dialogues throughout the Mass, the sign of peace, the chanting of the preface, even sometimes maybe the chanting of at least parts of the Eucharistic prayer. These are all things where the celebrant takes a primary role in chanting and singing, but oftentimes in dialogue with the schola and with the congregation. So those are the things that I was referring to.
So outside of the musical structure of the Mass, what's missing from these categories is what most people generally relate as the entirety of what sacred music is, and that is the hymns that are sung at church. So can you talk about the place that hymns have in the liturgy, particularly in the light of the directives of Vatican II and the post-conciliar documents on congregational song, beyond just orations and the dialogues? And then what would be some principles that could be insightful for choosing hymns to be sung at Mass? Yeah,
well, of course, hymn singing at Mass is in the Latin Church, in the Catholic Church is in terms of 2,000 years of history, is a relatively recent innovation. And I don't know all the history of that, quite honestly, and some of your listeners know it much better than I would. In terms of when hymn singing at Mass came into play, I think it was in the build-up toward the liturgical reforms of the Second Vatican Council. Hymns in the Catholic tradition really are more appropriate to the Liturgy of the Hours, or the Breviary, the Divine Office. That's where, in the Catholic tradition, that's where our hymns came from. Our grand, theologically rich hymns were really part of the Liturgy of the Hours, the Divine Office. That's where hymn singing was done in the Catholic tradition, where at Mass, traditionally, hymn singing was not common. And I think there's probably a Protestant influence here, where Protestant worship is of course full of hymn singing, and there is certainly a place for hymns, and I would not want to exclude hymn singing by any means from the sacred liturgy. I think we're a little out of balance. I would prefer to see us also sing some of the propers of the Mass, which are appropriate for that particular liturgy, the antiphons, if you will. But hymn singing is certainly appropriate, and it's one of the options given to us in the liturgical directives, in the Roman Missal itself, after listing all sorts of other options, beginning with, by the way, the propers, the antiphons. It lists a whole series of options, the Missal does, in terms of what can be sung. And hymns sung at Mass are certainly included in that. But what hymns? And what is appropriate? And again, this is where we come back to the qualities of sacred music. First thing is, the text of the hymns has to be theologically sound, and shouldn't carry any heterodox teaching in them. And not just sound, in other words, free from error, but also should teach. I think that the hymns should inspire the faith of the people and become a moment of catechesis for them. So certainly the text must be sound theologically, but also it has to carry with it those other qualities, the sacredness, the intrinsic beauty, and the universality, so that not every style of hymn, not every style of music perhaps is appropriate to the sacred liturgy. More secular styles, if you will, of music, would not be appropriate.
So on this question of secular music in the Mass, you address this further in your pastoral letter, and it's a little bit of a thorny issue, even historically speaking, because we can think of instances where secular tunes are used, for example, as the tenor part in a Renaissance Mass by celebrated composers that the Church puts forward as exemplary, people like Josquin or Dufay. And so there has been some sort of interaction between secular culture and the Church in terms of music. And we think especially in this regard of what Sacrosanctum Concilium says about adapting the liturgy to the cultures and the traditions of people. So, for example, in Article 119, it says, in certain parts of the world, especially mission lands, there are peoples who have their own musical traditions, and these play a great part in their religious and social life. For this reason, due importance is to be attached to their music and a suitable place given to it, not only in forming their attitude toward religion, but also in adapting worship to their native genius. So my question for you is, where does the Church draw this line between the influence of secular culture on the Church's sacred music, when she clearly asks that there be some use of a culture's distinctive music within the sacred liturgy?
Yeah, well, that's kind of the critical question, isn't it? And it's not a, I wouldn't say it's a, from my perspective, it's not a precise, line in the sand, so to speak. There needs to be some prudential judgment here. I would prefer that prudential judgment, be left to those in the Church with the proper either pastoral responsibility, and I would even say the bishops, along with musicians who, musicians who have the mind of the Church as well. To help make some of these, prudential judgments. I'm very influenced by something I read in Pope Benedict XVI's work, The Spirit of the Liturgy. And I don't remember the exact quotes from that work, but I remember when I read then Cardinal Ratzinger's work, the Spirit of the Liturgy. He talks about the fact that throughout history, there have been this constant danger of secular music creeping into the sacred liturgy, in some sense of a sense of an entertainment. So I can't remember all the exact examples he uses, but he goes through history, and I think he points out 2 or 3 times throughout history when the Church had to correct abuses that had crept into this area. Even some of the orchestral masses of the great composers, probably cross the line. I can think of one mass in particular, which I know is still used in some even parish settings, the Gounod's Mass of St. Cecilia, which is an incredible piece of work. It's very operatic, and it sounds very much like a secular opera, the style of the music. And I mean, one could question, does that cross the line? Is this an appropriation of a style of music that isn't appropriate? In terms of this enculturation, though, I think still those principles of the music having a sacred character, even though it's from a particular culture, for instance, we wouldn't go to, use the example earlier of the Vietnamese community. We wouldn't go to Vietnam and see, well, what are the Vietnamese listening to on the radio? What's the pop culture music in Vietnam right now, and say, well, we have to respect that culture and therefore we need to be able to incorporate that music. Or in a more common example, even in some of the Hispanic communities, the Hispanics have a certain sound, if you will. But that doesn't mean that we take mariachi music and say that that's, appropriate, for the sacred liturgy, even though mariachi music is very much a part of the culture in some parts of Mexico. So again, those qualities still need to be there, present to some degree. The sacredness, the holiness of the music, the artistic beauty of it, and the universality of it. As I said, I can recognize a sacred sound in a very oriental sounding kind of chant and singing in the liturgy that the Vietnamese would bring. So, I don't have a hard, clear answer on where that line is drawn, but I think those three qualities of the music still need to be kept in mind when making those cultural adaptations.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Archbishop, for making yourself available to us and sharing your insight and wisdom regarding sacred music. Your words and clarity have really helped us to understand what the Church teaches on these matters, and we're certainly honored to have had the privilege of speaking with you today.
Well, it's been a great delight for me to be with you, and anything I can do to help spread the Church's teaching in this area is a great opportunity. Thank you for all you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed our inaugural episode of Square Notes. Join us next time for an interview with an amazing couple, a former atheist and a former evangelical, who became Catholic through the beauty of the sacred liturgy, sacred music, excellent literature, and Catholic culture. And don't forget to check out our website, sacredmusicpodcast.com, for more information about today's guest and upcoming episodes.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory's Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole, from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is the first movement of Trio Sonata No. 6 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Peter Carter. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.